So you should see that pop up on your screens, and it just means that to continue, you need to give us your approval. So I'm going to hand over to Natasha. Natasha is HR Director at HMRC, previously HR Director in Ofwat, and it's been quite a champion over the years. I've known Natasha for quite some time, quite a champion over the years for diversity and inclusion. I actually met Natasha on a leadership program that we ran some years ago. It was cross central government. And I know since then, Natasha's been a great champion for diversity and inclusion and women in leadership. So Natasha, if you could share your thoughts on the challenges in HMRC of managing an agile workforce, keeping people motivated when they're perhaps home working, and how you've managed quite a major disruption to the way we work. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. Hopefully you and others can hear me loud and clear, but thank you for that wonderful introduction as well. So what I thought I would do, just to kind of set the scene, as Matthew described earlier, I work at HMRC, is I'll just set the scene a little bit in terms of what things were looking like for HMRC as we headed into the pandemic. So our role became even more critical during the pandemic, and I'm sure you'd agree. The Chancellor's schemes were paying out of a system that usually collects revenue and funds public services. So in terms of enabling us to continue to work in different working arrangements, things really happened in two phases. So we had a mobilise phase, which was about turning our configuration from an organisation that were office-based to one which was largely working from home. And then the second phase was around stabilising. So in the mobilise phase, the IT function enabled the capacity, as I said, the majority of the 64,000 workforce at HMRC to be able to work from home. The IT teams did that by extending the capacity so that people could get on the network, but not only that, they sent home thousands of bundles of equipment to those who were performing critical roles. And then we were in the phase where we started to see the critical worker status come through, and HMRC staff who are essential were afforded that key worker status. So for those operating critical services, this was essential to enable them to access schools, for example, for their children, so that they could actually attend work. So we had actually colleagues going into our offices and have continued to go to offices over the course of the last 7 months or so. So the safety of colleagues in offices was critical. Office space was made available in key locations with preventative measures such as additional cleaning put in place. And then, of course, we moved to COVID secure workplaces. So it hasn't been an easy time, as I'm sure it hasn't for other organisations too, but especially for an organisation of our size, as I was describing. We also had a number of exit schemes that were due to be closing within kind of weeks of us going into the pandemic. And so we had to respond really quickly by creating some flexibility for colleagues to potentially stay, if they chose to, stay longer with the department. And we had a really positive uptake of individuals who really wanted to join in the cause and actually support colleagues at what was presenting to be a really difficult time. So what I'm planning to do then for the remainder of the time is just share with you in that period what some of the challenges and barriers were, and also explore with you some of the opportunities and benefits that we found. So health and safety, again, this will be top of mind for us all. So whether it's working from home or working in the office, we know that colleagues were often in less than ideal environments at home, actually, in some cases, multiple adults trying to work from home. And without risk assessments, we were operating somewhat blind, and it was impossible for us as an organisation to mitigate all of the risks that were inevitably there. Colleagues would then flag issues, some of which were not easy for us to resolve. We couldn't make assumptions that actually everybody had Wi-Fi at home, or as I said, had an environment that was fit for purpose in terms of working from home for any period of time. But we were dealing with a really ambiguous situation and not knowing at that point the time frame of how long we'd be in this configuration. So with the home environment of each individual being so different and the circumstances within which we found themselves, we found that we were having to prepare managers to have conversations that where they applied judgment in each and every individual case. We were also concerned about loneliness, about domestic abuse, and technology fatigue, just to name a few things that were top of mind for us in that space. So then moving on to different working arrangements, I've touched on it a little bit already, but whether people were working from home or working in the office, we had these two economies that were running, and the perceived unfairness by colleagues was made known to us in no uncertain terms. We did support colleagues who were working in the office to be able to travel safely to and from work. We had to provide managers, though, with a lot of support to ensure that the ask from colleagues who needed to be in the office was really clear, and that nobody who felt wholly uncomfortable being in the office was made to do so. We had to provide a lot of reassurance around the safety of our offices, and we did that via videos and testimonials from colleagues in the office, which really helped, as well as leaders themselves working in the office, role modelling and demonstrating that it was safe to do so. So the technology mentioned already, that was in itself a barrier. So user capability has not always been where we would have wanted it to be. We were thrust into this scenario where we found ourselves spending the majority of our days on Teams. So colleagues had to get up to speed really quickly. And in some ways, this has presented us with an opportunity, I suppose, as well. But as we were getting up and running, it was a real challenge for our digital ambassadors to keep up with the demand. So we already had a smarter working program in the organisation where our digital ambassadors were really moving us to a smarter way of working, but we were by far not where we are now. We also couldn't assume, as I say, that everybody had the level of capability to use all of the kind of different technology applications. And so we've worked hard to really unpack and actually start to meet some of those capability gaps. So we then turn to back to people's home arrangements then, caring responsibilities. We know that colleagues had a range of caring responsibilities which were complicated by school closures, the closure of care homes. Many colleagues continued to work juggling those responsibilities, and for those who weren't able to, we supported them with paid special leave. And that was a position that was supported by our departmental trade unions, as you can imagine. But we had some more challenging discussions over the course of a number of months that presented us with all sorts of scenarios that we had to kind of work through. But understandably, the trade union's desire was to keep colleagues' safety at the forefront of everything. We kept lines of communication firmly open with them, and actually what we found that has actually built positive relations over a period of time. One of the other challenges that we came up against around Easter time was colleagues not taking annual leave. So we would typically find a large proportion of colleagues across the organisation would take leave over that kind of 2 to 3 week period. So we were storing up potentially some significant issues down the line. So whether that's people being burnt out because we were working under some obviously difficult circumstances, and we were turning around the new Chancellor's schemes in a matter of weeks, where typical policy would take us well over a year to implement the types of schemes that we were implementing. So those challenges prevailed, and when we were presented, particularly with the statistics around the levels of annual leave, we spent a lot of time thinking about how to encourage people to take time out, even if it wasn't to take their usual holiday, that normally would clearly be outside of their home. So our chief executive really took the mantle there and took time out and was very open about taking time out, talking very publicly about that and encouraging not only colleagues across the organisation, but actually encouraging senior leaders to set the right example. And the final area that I want to touch on is then around productivity. So we've had some challenges about being able to measure productivity in the same way. Managers feeling a loss of control in some cases. We've also found that this period presented an opportunity to consider whether actually our ways of working, in fact, have enhanced productivity in some aspects of the work that we do. So we're undertaking some trials so that we can really understand what is occurring. People have often referred to this particular period as a natural experiment, but of course, this wasn't an experiment that we had planned for. So we're doing those trials in a much more planned way. So I'm going to turn to the opportunities and benefits that we found in the organisation. I'm going to focus first and foremost on engagement. So the biggest opportunity that we have found has been the increase in engagement that we have seen. So our last pulse survey that was taken in July showed an increase of 13 percentage points. Now for HMRC, that's pretty unprecedented. And so it's probably interesting if I share a few insights as to what's driving that. So prior to the pulse survey, we also ran another survey similar to what we saw in the survey earlier. The majority of you said that your organisation has undertaken some type of survey to ascertain how people are feeling throughout this current pandemic period. So we conducted a your working experience survey and a pulse survey, and we ensured that there were different questions and different emphasis, but that gave us a really rich picture about what was driving how people were feeling in the organisation. So I'm going to touch on a couple of areas. People felt over 3/4 of respondents agreed that HMRC was doing a good job helping them to feel connected to one another. So we had put a range of different mechanisms in place, and we found that managers were making much more time to connect with their teams on a much more informal basis than the typical kind of team meetings. Trust. So over 90% of colleagues agreed that their manager trusts them to do their job effectively. That was pretty profound for us. So we have previously, in previous annual pulse surveys, found that levels of trust have been much more lower in the organisation. So that was a real kind of pleasant finding that came out of the survey. And in terms of remote workers, 40% of remote workers agreed that they were looking forward to returning to working in the office in the future, while only a third disagreed. And then in terms of those who were in the office, they were more frequently concerned around continuing to work in the office where hygiene and hot desking practices, and this it kind of went in place, and this was before we had COVID secure offices. So we found an uptick in that when we conducted the following pulse survey. And finally, just more generally, people across the board on all the typical engagement index questions that you asked responded more positively than they would have ordinarily in previous years. So some real green shoots there that we are looking as an organisation as to how we build on, and thinking about the things that have happened over the course of the last 6 or 7 months and what we can continue when we do get back to some form of working in the office. Couple of other points then just to pull out. Ways of working. So this has presented us with an opportunity to consider how we work and where we work. So HMRC back in 2014 set a strategy to reduce the number of offices to 13 regional offices and some specialist sites from around 150 plus offices. So we are partway through that transition. And so we're now considering how we use our office spaces to genuinely create opportunities for social connection and collaboration. And on the point of connection, colleagues have reported that they feel more connected to their teams, feeling that there's more space and time to get to know individual circumstances. We've also needed to be quite responsive and adaptive to policy making. We've worked with trade unions to develop suites of policies that have supported a range of different circumstances. And we've also empowered leaders and managers to make decisions that's based on judgment. And final point really to pull through has been around our emphasis on well-being and how we've connected that to our communication strategy. So we've used new and existing tools such as Yammer to create additional vehicles to engage with our workforce around well-being. The guidance and support that we have for colleagues is all in one place. We've been relentless at communicating around well-being via many mediums, and we continue to ensure that leaders and managers have the information they need to be able to support their teams. So that's a bit of a canter through, as I say, what the challenges have been and some of the opportunities and the benefits in this period, and how we're looking to take those things forward. Thank you. think you're on mute, Matthew.
It's so good that the speakers can provide guidance to the chair. Thank you very much, Natasha. And I will, as I was just saying, I'll come back and pose some questions that I picked up from listening to your talk there when we come back to the panel discussion. I just would encourage the audience to just remember to type in your questions in the Q&A function that we can have a look at and pose to our speakers later on. But anyway, I'm now going to hand over to David. There were some interesting things in that picked up. I mean, fascinating in a way that trust has increased, people feeling more connected. It sounds like there's been more connection between leaders and teams. And I was struck by the thing of empowering managers to make more independent decisions. And I'd be curious to know if similar themes are coming out in the FSCS. So David, I'm going to hand over to you.
Matthew, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I've got a picture of a plant right now as my main screen, so don't quite know what that is, but I will carry on. It's lovely to thank you very much, Matthew, for the invitation to join today. And so I'll follow a sort of similar, always helpful when you go second. I'm going to follow a similar format to Natasha, maybe set a little bit of the context and say a little bit about the FSCS as an organization, and then I guess take away in the same way our response to these challenges, and equally share some data. So the Financial Services Compensation Scheme protects all regulated financial products in the United Kingdom. We are unique internationally for the scope of the protection that we provide, but you'll probably know us best for the little FSCS protected badge on your banking app, because we protect savings in banks, credit unions and building societies up to the value of £85,000. But as I said, actually the scope of our protection is unique, because actually if the product is regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority, then it is protected by the FSCS. And since our launch in 2001, we've paid out billions in compensation to millions of customers. To put that in context of the current landscape, we have processed at this point this year as many claims as we had processed in the whole of the previous financial year. And this is before the bow wave that we anticipate of the real impact, long-term financial impact of COVID-19 hits the organization. So in a way, similar to Natasha, the organization had in March, when we went into lockdown on the 16th of March, and so as an organization a week before the national lockdown, we had to mobilize pretty quickly. Now, the big difference for us as an organization is one of size and scale. So we are a fraction of the size of the HMRC. So we're about 300 in total, which is about around 250 permanent employees and around 50 to 60 contractors. So about 300 in size. That's because we operate in partnership with Capita. So Capita are our principal outsourced partner. And so there's a further 300 staff in Glasgow also providing end-to-end claims related services. I guess one of the our starting point, which my sense is from Natasha's talk is probably different, is that as an organization, we had already fully embraced flexible working. So our starting point at the FSCS has been for about the last 2.5 years, that every job in our organization is flexible. So we turned the requesting process to request flexible working on its head, and said, rather than every employee having to explain to us or justify why the role could be worked flexibly, we said, actually, our starting point is that every job in the organization is flexible. That's genuinely our belief. So actually, at the beginning in March, we'd already got an organization that was using about 90% of the workforce was working flexibly in some way or another. The most common way being that they were working from home perhaps 1 or 2 days a week. But actually the full range of flexible working options. So we have people working part-time, we have people working compressed working hours, we have people staggering their start and finish times within the organization. It also meant, so that was an advantage because we already had an existing set of flexible working principles that were well understood and utilized in the organization. The second advantage was that in order to have made that happen, we had made a significant investment in technology. So part of our workplace transformation project, which we started 2 years ago, was to really rethink the way in which we operate as an organization. And partly that was to remove all desktops, was to replace them with laptops, was to establish a VPN, and was to actually enable our workforce to work pretty much from anywhere, whether that be sitting in Starbucks, albeit when not working on anything confidential, obviously, to working from home or working on the move. So when we mobilized in March, we were already in a pretty good place, and I'm incredibly proud of the fact that we didn't lose a day's production during this period, and nor, very similarly to Natasha, did we see a decline in overall productivity. But we recognized that this was a new and untested environment. And one of the things that Matt said at the beginning, which I completely agree with, is that, as the Mayor has said, we can't go back to business as usual. I think everyone recognized by the summer that the changes that we're implementing right now are fundamental changes to the way in which we're going to work now and into the future. And we broke this down, our approach we broke down into 3 key areas, which I'll talk to you a little bit about. So the first was around communication, the second was around well-being, and the third was environment. So firstly, in relation to communication, the question you asked at the beginning of the hour in the survey was, have you surveyed your organizations and your colleagues? We've conducted 4 surveys, 4 pulse surveys during the period of lockdown in March, May, August, and September. The March, May, and September questions were the same questions that we asked consistently throughout. And I'll come back to the August survey when I talk about environment, because that was actually about the evolution of our approach to the office. And the questions that we have asked consistently throughout are the connection to the customer, the company and our customers, the ability to concentrate and get things done, feeling like part of a team, feedback from your manager, your ability to disconnect from work, and your overall happiness. And also, one of the things that we felt was incredibly important was not simply for you to be able to mark a score on the survey, but that was to give us actual real feedback about issues, and also for you to be able to non-anonymize the survey if you wanted to share that data with us. So actually, if you were reaching out to us to say, my work environment isn't very good, or I'm having problems with technology, all of those things, we used that data. We actively encouraged an open conversation with our employees so that we would use that data to shape our strategy. And I guess I think that's one of the overarching messages that I would share today about the FSS's entire approach. This has been from the outset completely employee-led. And Natasha was saying, of course, the health and well-being of our employees is absolutely central to our approach. But we very explicitly said from the very beginning, we won't take a step, we won't take a strategic decision until we fully consulted with you and properly understood how you're feeling about these issues. So in March, so we asked those questions in March, we asked them again in May, and most recently, we have asked them in September. And I'm pleased that actually engagement levels throughout the period of lockdown have remained pretty consistent. pretty consistently high. So 89% of people saying that they feel connected to our customers, 91% of respondents feeling like they're part of a team, 92% of people saying that they are getting good feedback from their managers. And the lowest numbers, interestingly, are around our ability to disconnect from work, which is about 73, averages around 70%, and your overall happiness, which is about 75 to 77%, which is something that we've been very mindful of. So one of the observations I think we've all made is that when we are in this new environment, to quote a consultant I spoke to recently, we've been working in the flow of life. So we might have been juggling homeschooling, we might have been juggling caring responsibilities, or balancing, trying to get our pets or our children and not to interrupt our various meetings. And that in itself brings a completely different set of stresses and has a potentially huge impact on our mental well-being. So actually this ability to switch off has been one of the things that we've been really focused on within the organization. I mentioned that in August we did a slightly different survey, and I'm going to come back to that when I talk about our environment. I started to talk there about well-being, and absolutely, I think all of us, I'll give you a personal example. Very early on at the beginning, my very incredibly efficient business manager replicated my entire calendar within the first couple of weeks, as it is in the office, exactly as it was, and made it virtual. And what that essentially means is that you sit in a chair and you talk non-stop for about 6 hours a day. And that isn't sustainable and isn't good for anybody. So I think that us recognizing that actually, whilst the collaboration tools are amazing, and we use Office 365, as lots of people do, and again, we'd implemented that about 18 months ago, so people were already very familiar with the discipline of using Teams, but not in this way that actually your entire day is structured through virtual communication. So how do you ensure that people are taking the right amount of breaks, are structuring their working day in the right way? And I'm going to come on in a minute to talk about some of the changes that we've made as a result of the learnings from that experience and the feedback. But a bit like Natasha, you know, we've done it from a communications perspective. We've increased the amount of online engagement. So we try to replicate things that we do in the office, like coffee mornings, catch-ups with the chief executive, a weekly chief executive's message, including virtual meditation classes, yoga, cardio combat, wellness. So things, exactly the things that employees were asking for, we have tried to facilitate that in a virtual way, wherever that has been possible, to support their well-being. And lastly, I wanted to talk about environment. And so all of this has completely reshaped the way in which we think as an employer. So already being an organization where flexibility was central to our approach, we recognized that our flexible working principles needed to evolve. And so actually, the survey that we ran in August, when we had started to think about a phased, staged return to the office. So in August, government guidance, you will remember, changed and said, no longer work from home. If you're able to, you could start to think about returning to the office. We ran a separate consultation survey in August to ask a series of questions. Now I've got that on another screen, so I'm just going to move my cursor so I can open that up, so I can move to that one. There we go. And the questions that we asked were around a number of key areas. So firstly, we had a very high response rate. We had a 92% response rate to the survey. We wanted to understand how anxious our employees were feeling about a return to the working environment. And we asked people to categorize how they were feeling between very anxious, slightly anxious, comfortable, and excited. And 78% of our employees said they were feeling some level of anxiety. And actually, when you drilled into the reasons why they were feeling anxious, they weren't feeling anxious about the FSCS. They weren't feeling anxious about the fact that we had created a COVID secure working environment. They trusted us, actually. What everyone's anxiety was driven by was accessing public transport, was accessing the vast majority of our workforce, our commuters. We again asked these questions as part of the survey, and most people are commute twice. So actually they might get a train into a major London terminus and then get on the tube or bus. And actually that was what was driving massive anxiety levels in our employees. We also asked, when would you feel comfortable? When would you feel personally comfortable in coming back to the office? And again, this was about a sort of 65, 45, 55, 45 split. Right? So 55% of people saying, actually, I would feel comfortable coming back in 2021, and 45% of people saying, I would like to come back this year. And interestingly, one of my observations is that within that population, the vast majority, at least half of that group, wanted to come back as quickly as possible. We also then said, when you do come back, how often do you think you would like to be working in the office on a day-to-day basis? 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. And on average, most people said 1 to 2 days. So as a result, we've evolved some of our flexible working principles. So we've got 2 new rules. We got rid of core hours. So our contracts, most people work 35 hours a week. Our contracts within that will say the core hours are 10 to 4, you must be at your desk. We said, well, that doesn't make sense anymore. That doesn't fit with the working environment. So we've got rid of core hours, and we now have a 7 till 7 day. Where did we come up with 7 to 7? It's because it's the hours that our office building in the City of London are open. And actually, within that span, that's a pretty good day for working at home. Now, we're not suggesting, to be absolutely clear, that people work 12 hours. What we're saying is you might want to split up your day. Not only do we recognise that colleagues want greater flexibility about where and when they work, they want greater flexibility in the working day itself. So what they might want to do is they might want to work from home between 7 and 10. They might then want to come into the office for a series of meetings, avoiding public transport, do that for a couple of hours, and then go home, maybe have a break, maybe pick the kids up from school, and then maybe do an hour between 6 and 7. What we've been very explicit in saying, we've given our employees lots of different scenarios. Your day is entirely down to you and your team and your line manager for you to structure. The second thing we did was that in our flexible working principles, we'd always historically said, we think that the office has an amazingly important part to play in our working lives. And we continue to genuinely believe that. In our survey, in one of the conversations that we've had with our organisation, we've been very explicit in saying that permanent home working actually is not something that we think is right for the FSCS. I haven't got time to go into why, but one of the fundamental principles is because we actually think that the office is incredibly central to our culture of collaboration, creativity, and human interaction, the value of human interaction. Now, we used to say that we expected people to spend a reasonable amount of time in the office. And we recognized that actually what we needed to give people was a degree of certainty and clarity around what that means. And so what we call that our 40-40 rule, which is on average, you'll remember in the survey, our people said 1 to 2 days in the office. So actually 40% of your time, 40% of our workforce, 40% of the time on any average day is what we expect to see in the city. Excuse me. And these plans were already, having consulted with our staff to drive that strategy in August. We launched it very successfully in September, and in September, people had started coming back. I was giddy in the second week of September because we had 41 people in our office, which is the first time that had happened since March, and lots of colleagues that I'd seen for the first time since then. And then, of course, the government guidance changed again to working from home where we can. So we have paused our phased return. I wanted to just pick up on a few points before I finish from Natasha's presentation that I completely agree with, that we experienced very similar issues. So the importance of creating having the right home environment and not just assuming that everybody's working situation is fit for purpose. We introduced a new £200 equipment allowance for all employees at the FSCS to enable to support them. And the importance of ensuring that your collaboration tools are effective. Annual leave, actually, we gave some very explicit guidance and actually required people to have taken 5 days by the end of last month out of their allowance. We're going to allow people to carry over slightly more into next year, but equally we've set some guidance about where we think people's annual leave usage should be by December, and equally again in February. I'm going to sort of trust. There we go. Trust. I think that high trust is essential. You have to have a high trust culture to make a hybrid working environment operate. And what do I mean by a hybrid working environment? The reality is that, and we experienced this within the first two weeks of our staged return, is that we will always in the future have a situation where some colleagues will be working at home and some colleagues will be working in the office. And so actually thinking about what that means for every meeting that you have and how you organize and engineer that meeting to ensure that everyone is equally engaged, what that means for every training program that you run, what that means on a basic, very practical level for your day-to-day diary management. And I guess the question that we've been asking ourselves is, what is the office for? Because if you're simply getting up and leaving your desk at home to come and sit at a desk in the office and do this, and do virtual calls, you can pretty much do that from anywhere. Now, my diary always used to be, the principle was that my working from home days used to be the days that I freed up and were empty, and my days in the office was when I was going to face-to-face meetings. In a hybrid world, my suggestion is it's the opposite. I think that actually when you're at home, you're probably doing this, and actually when you're in the office, you're creating space, clearing space to have face-to-face human interaction with your teams, as indeed the executive team of the FSS have been doing for the last 2 days, hence why I'm talking to you from our offices today. The massive thing that we've learned, and Natasha is absolutely right, is the golden opportunity it gives to drive engagement in the organization. And our most recent pulse survey, we also asked a series of questions about our journey so far. So we said, we'd really like to know from you how well you think we've done. So 90% of our people said our customers have remained our primary focus. 91% said we have adapted to the challenges. 89% of people said they were clear about their priorities. 89% of people trusted the decisions that we were taking as an executive team. And 87% of people said we believe that we've continued to live our values of accountability, collaboration, and challenge. That's it from me.
David, that was fantastic. And Tasha as well, brilliant. A really fascinating insight into how organizations of quite obviously different sizes have dealt with it, and a lot of similarities. And I just a couple of observations from my side. Thanks, Natasha. And Matt Prima, if you want to come in as well for this discussion part. One of the just sort of reflections, observations on some of what you're saying. I mean, I had thought for ages that the 9 to 5, 9 to 6 rush hour mentality, the squeezing people on the Northern Line to get into the workplace, queuing up 3 trains on the platform, you know, for me, that's an overhang from the industrial age. And if you're a knowledge economy, if you have knowledge workers that, which is true of HMRC and FSCS and the GLA, is that why not do this thing of expanding your core working hours, as you said? I mean, I really feel like that's the positive shift for me that the pandemic has prompted, is exactly, you know, David talking about expanding, well, getting rid of core working hours and having a 7 to 7 means people can stagger their travel times. And that some of the true things for me, the essence of agility is, you know, you might want to work 2 hours starting from 7 to 9 and then take your children to school or whatever, or do something else, come back to work. And all of that, the idea of getting rid of core hours will help that. And so I hope that stays. And there's the idea of a hybrid working, and that, you know, part-time at home, part-time in the office, you know, you go into the space which best suits the task that you have to do. And if you go into the office, then the benefit is the face-to-face meeting. It's a stimulation of that interaction. It's hopefully, you know, catalyzing more creativity. And then when you need to be quiet and concentrate, go home. And so I think, you know, you've enacted a lot of the positive things that can come out of it. A couple of questions, and I will pose those. There's a couple of questions from the audience, but Natasha, you mentioned the trust had gone up, and I'm just wondering, what do you attribute that to? The fact that managers have been sort of happy and comfortable to allow people to work from home. What do you attribute that increase in trust to?
So I think it's a combination of things, Matthew. I think it's not necessarily that managers were comfortable, right? Because actually we were forcibly put into this situation.
Well, yes, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, and so I think actually it's pushed both colleagues who are typically managed and managers and leaders into a space that none of us were particularly comfortable with, but has demonstrated that colleagues still deliver. Yeah. So no longer is the notion that, as you said, you know, back to the Industrial Revolution, the notion that we have to be overseeing a colleague for them to be productive. And what's really interesting, just going back to something that David was talking about in terms of kind of ways of working and kind of, you know, what was happening in your organization before the pandemic. Colleagues were working flexibly, right? Before the pandemic, they were working in a multitude of ways. I've been doing it. My son's 15 now, since he was probably 2 or 3 years old at nursery. What's happened though is that not only have we very quickly expedited the mass population working in this way, now it's okay to be open about it. So I remember the times, right? I can be open and I can be open with you guys, your friends now. I remember times when Kyra was in the back of the car and I'm going, shh, mommy's about to dial into a conference call, right? Whereas now people will expect my 15-year-old to walk behind me in his dressing gown. And so there is something about social acceptance, I think, as well, Matthew, that has occurred in a really short space of time. Yeah. And I think the trust has increased because people are feeling also open to talk about.
Yeah. They can disclose. They feel more comfortable.
Exactly. I've got all of these things going on for me, but I still want to do a great job, right? If you can support me, I will deliver what you need me to deliver.
Brilliant.
Can I just jump in there and add, because you were making me laugh, Natasha, when you were saying that. It's absolutely right. I mean, it used to be called shirking from home, is what they called it at the FSCS. You know, because it was like you can't possibly be being, you know, productive and thing. So I think it's helped. But Ursula, I do think there is something about the paradox of actually, whilst we've been more distant, we're actually more intimate. We know much more about each other's lives. And, you know, I shared with Matthew the other day, and Natasha, you know, I don't know my boss's, you know, 11-year-old son. I've never met him, but I feel like I know Alex personally, and I could tell you what snacks he likes because he's constantly in the cupboard behind her in the kitchen and to go into the snack cupboard. But I think people have really responded to that. I think actually people have really, I think that's a massive positive that's come out of this process.
Brilliant. Good. And actually, from this session and from talking to you during the briefing sessions before tonight, I have to say I was kind of pleasantly surprised about how much engagement had gone up rather in your organisations and others. And I also talked to an insurance company in the city whose phrase was, you know, some of the senior leaders had a pathological fear of home working, and that's been almost completely eliminated. You know, what better way to do it than do a live experiment, as it were. And one other question, David, well, a couple of things. One was the right amount of breaks, and then we can, by the way, carry this discussion on when we flip to the Zoom meetings. Natasha, are you able to stay around for a little bit longer? No pressure. It's work-life balance.
Yeah, no, you've got me up until probably about 6:05. So I'll keep going for a little while.
Okay. Well, we might make the most of Natasha and go up to 6:05 and then flip over to the next part, if I may. And I've got a question here from Steve Simper, which I'm not absolutely sure what it's saying. And I might try and bring Steve, if you're still there, I might try and bring you in to articulate your question in person in a second, but I just wanted to just quickly on the thing of the right amount of breaks, and that is in a way, it's a sort of it's a detail, but it's quite an important detail about how we do our work. And I absolutely have noticed, for me, doing seminars and training courses, concentrating on a screen and talking to colleagues somehow takes more energy or more brain power or something. And we've re-engineered our training courses to make them shorter and more breaks more often. And I just wanted to check in with you, David. You said that you do the sort of virtual meditation, you have coffee breaks. Was that to encourage people to take perhaps more breaks or the right amount of breaks?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the start, and I think all organizations were probably the same, I think we, through the kitchen sink, every engagement activity that we were like, oh my God, we need to be overly communicating. But I think one of the key messages was exactly that, was that I think the fact that it's very easy when you're not commuting, so that what you do is you get up at the same time. I don't know about the rest of you, but what I found I was doing was getting up at the same time and then, having a cup of coffee, sitting at the desk. So I'm already at the desk at, 6:30 when I'd normally be getting on the train. I've already done 2 hours. I've done 3 hours work by 9:30. And then, my husband would come home and go, oh, it's 5 o'clock and you're still sitting at the desk. And I think I think we were really explicit right from the very beginning of saying, don't fall into that trap of, it can't be, think about how you structure your day, but get up, go out and have a walk at lunchtime, go out and do something, go to the gym, go and, because it's really easy that extra time that you're being given by not commuting ends up being, have a 10-hour working day. That's not what we want.
And it's a discipline for all of us, because it's so easy just to kind of get, you get stuck into something. You almost need I don't know if there are reminders in Yammer to tell people to take a break. Steve, I'm going to bring you in. I'm clicked on allow to speak. So Steve, if you're still there, you're on mute, I can see, but do you want to pose your question? Because your question was, there remains a big question as to whether or not staff are working from home or home working. And I'm not sure absolutely the difference between those two. Steve, if you can hear me, you should be able to unmute yourself. Is anybody? Steve's not coming in.
Zoom webinar. Question.
Can you hear me now?
Alert.
Steve, yes, I can hear you.
Yes. Hello. Sorry, I'm using a screen reader, so you might hear my screen reader come over the top of me.
That's all right.
So the difference that I'm referring to is that if I'm simply, having a day at home working, that's actually different from me being a home worker. Because
right.
as a home worker, I would have, the legislation that covers my place of work would be very different if I was a home worker. And there's been a number of quite high profile cases, mainly in Europe, where companies have been fined significant amounts because the workplace, the person's home, is not suited. And there's even one local authority in the UK who is suggesting that the non-smoking policy would apply to people working in their own home, which I think might be a step too far. But I think Natasha and the other speaker spoke about how we equip people to work at home. And if the expectation is that I'm now working at home on a more regular basis, then what is my organisation's responsibility, which happens to be the NHS, to look after me at home?
Well, if I can, just a little bit of insight. From what I understand, looking at what the HSE's position is, that the employer has just as much a duty of care for you as an employee if you're working from home as if you're working, in their offices. So, there's still that legal obligation. How that is, how that plays out, I'm not absolutely sure, because as I think you said, Natasha, there's a limit to what you can do in terms of a risk assessment or ask someone to do in their own home.
And just to chip in there, Matthew, because so I absolutely understand the point, Steve, and it's a tricky set of circumstances, because never have we been in a position where all organisations have been kind of forcibly have their workforce working from home. And I think the debate continues, quite honestly, about whether it is working from home or whether individuals are home workers. But I know at HMRC, we are working through, as I said, our location strategy and also the flexibility that we can offer colleagues. So we know that there's a high proportion of colleagues that would want greater flexibility. And so we're looking at, any reform that we might make down the line, where's the opportunity to build that flexibility in, but we are quite clear that we are an office-based organisation and we haven't moved away from that position, albeit we know we're going to be in this configuration for another few months yet.
All right.
Yeah, and I just add, Steve, I said it's interesting because this is one of the reasons why I said I wouldn't go into the reasons, but actually, you've highlighted a number of the issues that as an organisation. So, legally, at the point that your home becomes your place of work, that completely changes things from an employment perspective. So you'd have to have the liability insurance because it becomes a place of employment, and then who picks that up? Is it the employer who's picking it up? So actually, you're right to rate, because I think I don't think. And there's a really lovely phrase that somebody used right at the very beginning of lockdown, and they said exactly to your question, and they said we've got to get away from this thing of saying that we are working from home. Actually, we're working at home during a crisis, trying to work. And I thought actually that is exactly what we're doing. And I think as we now, I think this thing, which is why I think, as we move into sort of hybrid world, we've made a very conscious choice. We said to employees, the office still has a part in and so you won't become a permanent home worker if you work for the FSCS. But some of that was also driven by it. You get into a really, Natasha's right, this is still evolving, I think, as a debate and a discussion about where do you draw the boundary lines? And it's quite complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. I've just asked Chris Wolf to unmute, because you've got a question. Do you have a view on how hybrid meetings will work effectively? So I was thinking hybrid as in, so is it a hybrid meeting where some of the participants are in the office and some of them are online? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that was where my question is. So we've all been in meetings before the current situation where someone was remote and had dialed in and some people were in the office. And there is always a disparity in power and disparity in technological communication connectivity. I was listening very interestingly to David's perspective, where 40% of the workforce are expected to be in 40% of the time, which implies that 60% of the workforce are at home and are unable to interact face-to-face because of whatever their current situation is. And so some of the team are in the office and some of them are at home. And I was very interested to see if you guys had a view on how that might operate effectively to ensure that those times when people are trying to collaborate, it still works. When we're all at home, it's very easy, as we are seeing here.
Chris, two quick things, because I know, because I wanted to give Natasha the opportunity. I think, firstly, in relation to the 40-60 rule, I think it goes back to my observation about what's the office for. So actually, that time that you're coming in is the time that you should be doing team meetings and training and actually that we would be encouraging people to utilize that time to do face-to-face team activities. And already, even though we've now paused our phased return, I've been having communication with people this week saying, can I come in with the team, because it'd be really good to be able to do that face-to-face and we can do it socially distanced in a COVID secure environment. I think the thing about the meetings is a real challenge, and I think that is going to require us to learn. It's not just about the technology. I think it's about actually learning new behaviors and adapting our behavior, because you're right, in the past it might be one person phoning in and all of the rest of you in the room. We've already had experience of this at the FSS with actual board meetings, where you're like, okay, there's 5. It's more difficult when you go, there's 5 of you in a room and 6 of you on the screen. So I think there's definitely some thought that needs to go into how do you make sure that people are engaged in the same way, that you're keeping the conversation, you're referring to people right in the right way during the conversation. So I think you're right to raise it. I don't know what the answer is right now. I think it's a skill that we're going to have to develop.
And I think Natasha's got another meeting to go to, haven't you?
Yeah, I have, but I just wanted to give one small build on David's point. So I agree with all that David said. I think there's a huge opportunity here, right, to create a new framework in terms of how we work and to create new, you know, as David said, new behaviours. What are the new norms? And so one of the things that we've been reflecting on actually as a senior HR team is we have found that our meetings have actually been more inclusive when we've been working remotely. So how do we capitalize on that and not go back to a place where actually those people in the office location appear to have more of a voice, or it's just technologically easier to have that engagement? So I think it's about a new framework, right? I think we've got to keep asking ourselves the question and posing, you know, what are the different practical ways and what are the things that we can test? I think we need to experiment as well. And on that note, I'm going to dip out and I hopefully should be able to join a little bit later on in the breakout groups.
All right, brilliant. Thank you very much, Natasha. So I am going to end this session. Thank you very much, David, our contributors. Thanks, Matt, for introduction and giving us a little insight into where the mayor's coming from. So take a 5-minute break.
Oh, good. I was going to say, do we get a break?
Take a 5-minute break. If you need a longer break, then please do so. And I'm just very quickly going to share my screen just to remind you of the link to use to get back into the other session. Hopefully you can see that on your screen, and I'm going to put it into the chat as well, so you can, if I can find it, where have I gone with the chat? You should have it in your, right, I'm going to have to close that down, I think, before I go. But anyway, thank you very much, everybody. And if you can, where are we now? I'm going to put it in the chat to everyone. Please do click on this link, which I've just put in the chat function, and we'll see you in about 5 minutes for and I'm going to break you probably into 3 groups. I've got some questions to pose for you, and we'll see you then. Cheers, Matt.